Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another Demystifying post-production Motion Monday. My name's Ellie, I'm a trainer at Maxon. I'm joined once again by some very special people. So hey to Dustin, Lionel, and Chad. How's it going, guys?
Hello,
Good. How you
easy.
doing, Allie?
Happy Monday.
I'm good, yeah, happy Monday. Happy Hot Monday. We've already got some people in the chat saying hey. So we've got Charles, we've got Janet, Jim, Sam, Marcelo, Alan, Scott. Nice to see you guys. Thanks for being here with us. And yes, so a few people have already been commenting on the weather. So Janet's from a hot Switzerland, saying, have you been for a swim today in Paris? So Lionel, maybe that's what you'll be going to do later on today.
I wish.
Same here, same here. Cool. So before we jump into what we're going to be doing today, let's have a look at the amazing stuff that's happening this week and this month as a training team and just an entire Maxon collective. So if you head over to this page here, which is the Maxon events page, you can see all the stuff that's happening over this week and over this month. As we can see today, we have our Demystifying post-production series, which is all to do with particles. And we're already on week 3. And so I'm going to hand over in a little bit to Chad, who's going to talk to us about what we're going to be doing today. But before we do that, let's just see what else we've got going on. So on Wednesday, we have our 3D motion design show where we're featuring some really amazing artists, and that's going to be on the Maxon YouTube live stream. So not the training team, but the actual Maxon VFX YouTube. And then we also have Max's great color grading show with a bunch of useful sort of like color tips and workflows. I think he's looking at some saturation tips on Thursday, and that's going to be on our Maxon Training Team YouTube live stream. And then again, we have a bunch of other things you can just have a little scroll through and see. We also have live events on there as well. So if any of you are heading over to SIGGRAPH in Canada, I might see you guys there. If you ever miss any of these sessions or you want to catch up on all this great stuff that we do, all you have to do, head over to the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel, and everything's on here, and it's all timestamped as well, which is great. So you can see all of the upcoming live streams, all of last week's sessions, this is like the recent uploads, and then all of the other great series that we do, all in playlists. Also, you know, we love to say thank you for being part of our amazing Maxon community by giving you guys free t-shirts, kind of like this one I'm wearing right now. So if you head over to the handout section inside of GoToWebinar, you will see this page, which has some really useful links. The links we just looked at, including the special merch link. You do need to enter the password, which is particle magic, and then you'll open up that secret merch link, and it's good for one shirt. All you have to do is pay for shipping, but trust me, it's worth it. And we also have our project files on here as well. So yes, handout section of GoToWebinar to find that, or if you can't find that, sometimes it doesn't always show up, let us know in the questions and we can share that with you. That is not a problem at all. So as we said today, week 3 of this particle series, we've been diving into all different types of software. So last week we had the pleasure of having Bob Wormsley from Insidium joining us. And as we said, if you want to catch that, all you got to do, head over to the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. And in the original week, so week 1, we looked at C4D's native particles. Lionel went through a bunch of that as well, which was great. And so Chad, what are we going to be doing on this week 3? What are we going to be covering today?
So today's all about After Effects. So what we're going to do, actually, let me steal the screen so I can show you. Do you have an easy way to do that?
I can throw it to you. Yeah, that's cool. Here you go.
Okay.
Let me chuck it over.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Yes, 1 second. Sorry.
No worries.
Are you seeing my After Effects?
Yes.
You do.
Okay. So what we're going to get to eventually is I recreated Starry Night by Van Gogh. You probably can't hear the music, huh?
Ooh, that's cool.
That's cool. Yeah, no, we can't hear it, but it looks amazing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, ask Dr. Sassy or Simon or somebody I'll give you the one with the audio. So essentially I recreated Starry Night with Trapcode Particular. So we're going to get into that because today's all about After Effects. But before we get into Starry Night, I wanted to give you a little bit of history about this painting. So we're going to be doing some weird stuff today on Demystifying. But before we even get into that, I wanted to also give you a little history about particles in After Effects. Just a few minutes about the native particle tools in After Effects and maybe some of the history of like where we've kind of come from a little bit. And also, I mean, some of this is nostalgic, but some of this also is kind of helpful because a lot of times you have to work on site and you have to work on client machines, and sometimes they might not have Maxon 1 or Trapcode Particular or whatever, and you have to kind of like improvise. And so I find myself in that situation a lot. So very quickly, before we get to this stuff, we're going to just look at some other tools, like where things came from. When I first started learning After Effects in like 2000, 2001, this tool was all the rage, Particle Playground. This was like the ultimate tool in After Effects. And one of the things that Particle Playground could do is recreate in the Matrix, which had just come out, the falling random animated text characters. And so then it was like this really big deal, even though it rendered slow and it's like super confusing. And what's really interesting, if we look at this, you know, we see that, and you'll notice this as we go through some of these like tools really quickly, that there wasn't a standardized way of doing particles. I mean, if you think about it back then, like, you know, particle simulations wasn't something that they were doing necessarily like on the Star Wars movies practically. Like they didn't have particle simulations like that, didn't come along until later. So we're gonna see some of this kind of like evolution of where particles and particle systems came from. And so here we have like a cannon. We don't have an emitter, we have a cannon, because again, the vernacular hadn't been standardized yet. Nowadays, if you're in X Particles, Cinema 4D, Particular, Maya, 3ds Max, anything, like you're gonna have an emitter. It's gonna be called an emitter. But again, the verbiage hadn't been standardized just yet. So in Particle Playground, we have two things, basically. We have a cannon, which default looks kind of like a Trapcode Particular a little bit. And then we also have a grid. And so we could do, let's say, like 3 particles across, 3 particles down. I'll change the color so we can see that a little bit better. And so we have this like grid of particles that can fall down, and we could emit from the cannon and or the grid. And again, we don't really have much to play with here, but we did have the ability to use other maps, and we're seeing kind of maybe like the beginnings of what became the Trapcode tools. So we have, you know, a grid of particles, kind of like Trapcode Form. We have a cannon of particles like Trapcode Particular. We have a little bit of physics. We have gravity and the ability to repel or bounce off of a wall. And we also have the ability to use layer maps. So we're seeing like in embryo, some of the things that later on we would use and that we're going to use later today. One of my favorite early tools is something called foam. And a lot of these tools, when you first apply them, they have this kind of like working view because computers weren't strong enough to show you the full particles back then. So I'm going to take the view from draft to rendered, and you could see what this does. And, you know, it's got bubbles. And I don't know about you, but I haven't had the need to render bubbles very often in my work. But what's really cool about foam is that I can create a custom particle very easily. And I didn't have that ability to do that at least easily in Particle Playground. So I could create a new layer here, like the star, and go to foam and go to my rendering and change this from a default. But there's also these different like colors of, you know, bubbles if you want to use that. But I can also choose user defined and then use my shape layer. We have some orientation and size issues. You know, if I blow this up, you know, we have, because this was built for SD, so then my shape layer orientation needs to be stretched in order to look normal there. And so there we now have custom particles. But, you know, this is, you know, these particles wobble non-uniformly. So if you wanted to create kind of like wobbling particles, this is still one of the only ways I know of to do that. So that's foam and my go-to particle system for a very long time until I had Trapcode Particular. And then we have Shatter, which isn't a particle system technically, because it just blows things up. But the cool thing about Shatter is that we start to see 3D brought into the world of After Effects. Again, this is a very old effect. I changed the view to rendered, and then I go into the camera position, adjust the Y rotation, and you see we have like 3 objects, which, you know, and these days, you know, when we're doing X Particles and Cinema 4D stuff, it's like 3D objects, who cares? But in the world of After Effects, that was a really big deal. And everything that I've shown you so far is just a completely 2D system. So even though these weren't 3D particles, these are 3D objects that we could actually use a light from in the scene and use a camera with, which is pretty epic. Or the ability just to kind of like rotate around something was really great, but still a lot to be desired. So then we started being able to kind of like hack things. So if I create some text here, and actually I'll just create a bunch of like, oops, yeah, we'll just create a bunch of asterisks. We can actually use the type animation tools in After Effects, or I can go into animate here and let's just say, well, first I want to enable per character 3D, so I could adjust each character in 3D. And I can animate the position. And so then let's say that they kind of move this way and this way and this way. And then I'm going to add a random or a wiggly selector so that they kind of are all over the place. And then if I make a camera here, again, this isn't 3D particles, but we do have objects that exist in a three-dimensional space. So I could go into my camera and I could turn on depth of field, increase the aperture a lot. And there we go. So we're starting to have this kind of like, you know, we could rack focus on these particles, but this is actually text here. Now we can do the same thing with shape layers. And I'm just gonna go ahead and skip over that for the sake of time, but we can create a shape layer and replicate it and move it back in 3D space. And again, not a particle system, but the ability to move 3D objects and to create multiple versions of something, and going back in 3D perspective. And those things, you know, are kind of like substitutes for good particle systems. Then Adobe acquired a company called Cycore and started including the Cycores, like basically a collection of effects, started including those with After Effects. And still to this day, this is the most powerful way to create particles natively in After Effects if you don't have the Trapcode tools or a third-party plugin. So CC Particle World is the most powerful particle tool natively in After Effects these days. If I click on this plugin, you can see that we get these kind of like gizmos. We could rotate this around in 3D, and then we have these little you know, lines that shoot out, and we can change the particle type and whatnot. So we can go to like a shaded sphere, which is kind of an interesting thing. And I'll show you a little quick example, a 2-minute example here. There's another effect actually, which is similar to CC Particle World, but it's just a little bit less complicated with like stuff on the screen and whatnot. And so it's a little bit easier and cleaner to explain, and that is CC Particle Systems 2. So if I do a search for this and apply it, you see we have something similar without all of the gizmos, and we can, you know, adjust the producer. So again, it's still not called an emitter just yet, but we're called an emitter, and we can animate this over time and change some of the physics, just very rough, basic stuff. But this is what you have to deal with in After Effects if you don't have Particular. Now I have this example that I've already kind of like wired up here, kind of with the default settings. A little UFO I made up. This example is like a decade old, by the way. But I had this UFO that I made in Cinema 4D, and it kind of moves, and then kind of like, let's see, so this is gonna take a long time to render apparently. Not really, but okay, there we go. So I just animated basically the producer with the default settings there. To follow the UFOs, it kind of like spins around and moves. And we could go into these settings here, and I could change, let's say, the particle type from line to, let's say, shaded sphere. And then I can go and change the animation to, let's say, direction normalized. So we have a little bit more of like a focus to that. This extra parameter, which is apparently kind of like similar to a spread, I'll take this down to 0.2, so we have a little bit more of a trail. And then I'll take the opacity. So I'm basically doing what I do in Particular here. If I'm gonna create smoke from scratch, I don't have much control over the particles. I'll tend to make them very low opacity, very feathered edges and very large. And that's kind of like the formula that I use to, at least to start with, if I'm making smoke in Trapcode Particular. And this illustrates something that I think is really helpful. And that is that when you learn a particle system, like if you learn X particles, or if you learn the native Cinema 4D particles, or if you're learning Trapcode Particular, like you can take what you learn and apply that to any other particle system that you know. So it's like the knowledge transfer. The idea is that over life, this happens, or when you change the particle sprite, this happens, or whatever, like that can translate with you. Some of these tools that seem very crude and rudimentary, I mean, they kind of are, but when you have knowledge of a more advanced particle system, you could bring that with you, and you can create some extra stuff. So maybe I'll take down the birth rate a little bit, take down longevity to like 0.4, and maybe take the birth color to like a bluish color. And yeah, so I mean, this isn't really that incredible. Maybe make some more size variation. Let me take down the opacity like a little bit more. So again, it's still not incredible, but you know, it's definitely better than it seems like it could have gotten from the default settings. So that's kind of fun. And I wish that GoToWebinar had the ability for sound, because I got a musical. you can't hear that, but it's a car peeling out, and so it sounds really funny. It's like, you know, it's like screeching, peeling out. And
I was literally about to say, I feel like you should do the noise, and then you just did it.
I want to hear the sort of cackling laugh that he just did at himself. I love it.
Oh yeah, I always get into trouble because like when I'm sitting here and when I'm working, I'm always just like, you know, I'm doing things like that because I'm alone in my office and no one can hear me, and it's fine. And then I do all these things like GoToWebinar because there's no sound, where I embarrass myself. So anyways, we should move on.
It's okay. I do it too, Chad. I do it too.
I feel like if you don't do these things, you're just not normal. Right?
I mean, it's almost like one of the signs that like you're part of an artist. Like if you don't make sounds, you know, it's like keep working at it. You know, you're not quite there yet. But if you're making sounds, you're making motion graphics, and you're like, and you're doing things like this, then it's just like you've arrived. You know, you're getting there. Okay.
There's a question from someone.
Yeah.
Can you show us how you made the smoke follow and change direction with the saucer? Is it keyframe or did you parent it?
Great question. So I believe that I brought over a null from Cinema 4D that was tracked to the UFO. But effectively, that's all we're doing here is that like you animate the producer position. So there isn't a way. Well, CC Particle Systems 2 is a 2D particle system. Great question, by the way. It is just a straight 2D particle system. So I can't remember if I brought the data over from Cinema 4D or just like animated it by hand. But even though the UFO kind of like turns and spins and is kind of moving in 3D, if you look at the particle system, it's kind of like seeing behind the curtain. It's really not doing anything. It's just kind of like hanging out there, just barely moving in 2 dimensions. So sometimes particle systems, even 2D particle systems, can be forgiving in that way. So yeah, and animating the producer, like I mean, you can see the difference that makes. I mean, it's a pretty big difference. You animate the producer, it just creates these beautiful trails, and then those trails can become shapes based on like how it's moving and stuff like that. There's a lot of power there. So hopefully it answers that question. It's probably not a very fulfilling answer, but hopefully that helps. Thank you for asking questions, by the way. That's great. Okay, so let's talk about nowadays what we can do and the power here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Starry Night, because I was thinking of like, what could I do with particles? And I thought, like, you know what I'd really like to do is I'd like to recreate Starry Night. I'm kind of on this like big Van Gogh kick. I went to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam a couple months ago, and I don't know, I'm just like really on fire about Van Gogh right now. And this painting, Starry Night, is one of my favorites. I think it's favorite for like a lot of people. It's kind of been one of my favorites for a really long time when I first started like seeing art. And to me, Starry Night is just like the quintessential piece of art. Like if there was like a sentient robot or like an alien life form that came to Earth and they were like, why do you art? I would I would say Starry Night is like the thing. This is why we art, because of Starry Night. And Starry Night, just again, a little bit of history about this. Starry Night is one of the most human pieces that I could think of, because it's this amazing blend of beauty and sadness. It is like life itself, because this was painted in 1889. This is a year before Van Gogh took his own life. And so when we first look at this painting, it's like, wow, it's just gorgeous. There's so much life and there's so much vibrance. But as we dig in a little bit into the story of this, there is so much sadness here. It's a pretty dark and haunting piece as well. So, you know, when we look at this piece, maybe a better way to start analyzing this is to look at where he came from. So this is 1889 that he painted this. And a year before, in 1880, he painted something that was thematically similar, but visually very different. And this actually has a very similar name. This is also called Starry Night, but it's Starry Night over the Rhone. And you can see that, you know, there is an interest here. The beauty in the painting is coming from the reflections of the lights and the stars, and there's people and boats, and this is where the attention is. In that same year, he also painted the Cafe Terrace at Night, another one of his more famous pieces. And again, we see the stars, like from Starry Night. Our stars are not, you know, natural looking stars, they're stylized stars. But his interest is obviously in, you know, what's going on with the people and down here and the things of Earth. But over time, then we start to see this Van Gogh where the stuff of people is losing its interest. There's not much passion put into this stuff on the bottom. It's like his heart wants to be somewhere else. And it's not like this like goth, emo, dark, depressing thing where he's just like, oh, woe is me, life is terrible. And like that's kind of the beauty of this piece, where he's kind of like just wanting to see the other side. He's fantasizing and romanticizing the great beyond. So all of this beauty and all of this magic and all this movement is really kind of him foreshadowing and fantasizing about you know, being in the next world, so to speak. And then right here in the foreground, we have this cypress tree, which is like, you know, one of the most like comedically, you know, odd structures, because it's like there's like this composition, and then all of a sudden there's like one huge tree right in the foreground, like demanding us to look at it. And you know, this cypress trees, they represent death. And you know, Van Gogh's famous for painting sunflowers, which are symbols of light and life, and they point towards the sun, and they're just, you know, these bright, cheery flowers. And Van Gogh himself said that, you know, cypress trees are almost like the polar opposite of sunflowers. And so, you know, one wonders if the cypress tree isn't like Van Gogh himself, like this representation of Van Gogh himself, where his feet are planted on the earth, but kind of stretching towards something different, stretching towards the beyond. So it is, you know, a dark painting, but there is also a beauty to it. And that's why, to me, this is like the quintessential piece of art. It is darkness and light. It is sadness and beauty, like all mushed together in this beautiful thing. So with that background, I set out to try to recreate this using Trapcode Particular. And one of the things that's very interesting that I'm going to tell you about is that when I teach tutorials, sometimes it's kind of frustrating. One of my challenges that I do in secret, my secret shame, is that I often want to teach people the best way to do something, but when I set something up, it's the most like backwards wrong way to do it. And I do this a lot in real life. And this is what is going on with me. This is how I really actually set things up. What I'll do is I'll wonder, can I pull this off? Like, is this something that I can actually feasibly do? And so then I'll start experimenting, and then I'll go so far with the experiment to prove. I'll do color correction. I'll do everything out of order, but just to see, can I pull this off? Is it something that I can actually do? And then by that point, I'm so far along in the wrong direction where I've done like color grades and stylization, all these things you shouldn't do until the end, that I'm just kind of like upside down. So the project becomes like bloated and slow. And I don't know if anybody else does that, because I know there's like the right way to work. And like you don't stylize things or color grade things until the end, you know, things like that. Like you do them, there's an order you're supposed to go in to be like the most efficient. And I teach that, but I don't do it. So do as I say and not as I do.
I'm with you, by the way. I'm
really?
100%. Yeah, if I'm trying to like work out something that I want to try and learn to do, like in like cinema or Redshift, I'll go like absolutely like backwards around the houses just to figure out how I can get the thing done, and then almost like get to the final point and I'm like, okay, now I need to like teach this and do it in the right way.
I mean, so this is an interesting, you know, kind of sway to the conversation, because you know, I feel like as artists, you know, you're always seeking the perfect way. You know, and we're often seeking the wrong information. Like take photography, for example. It's usually like, what camera did you use? Like what settings, you know, did you use in your camera? And I'm like, look, man, like you put your light here, you do these things, and that's what we have post for. You know, traditionally, like photography purists will kind of scoff at it and it's not the right way. But I'm like, look, you know, we're making art. Like at the end of the day, what you're doing is creating a piece that people can feel or derive some type of emotion from. And how we get there doesn't always matter. Like I feel like a lot of times what I preach is, you know, just kind of do it, like get it done. It doesn't really matter, you know, the route that you take, especially if you're not working in the industry. Obviously there are pipelines and workflows for a reason, you know, but definitely understanding how to break down a process, or even more importantly, the thought process as to why and how you did something, rather than just going the wrong way. Because I feel like sometimes the best artwork is created on accident on that wrong path, and then it can lead towards like fruitful, you know, pieces of work. So just kind of there we go.
No,
I'm just sitting down here.
I appreciate you guys sharing that, because like I totally agree. But so many times, you know, especially like on these webinars, like we talk a lot about, you know, like what the buttons do, but like, you know, I don't share that much about like the art stuff, like the stuff about like the Starry Night, the stuff that like really motivates me. And those are the type of things, like when I'm talking with clients, like that's the stuff that I am actually having conversations about. And like I have to figure out the buttons like some other way, but like I really need to understand the story, the narrative of the piece. I need to understand the emotions, and so that's what most of the conversation's about. And so like, and when we talk on these things, like we don't talk often about, you know, our process and about like the artistic stuff of it. I totally agree with you that like, you know, it makes me sad when I'm like, I'll make something and people will be like, well, what settings did you use for this? And like, I mean, those are good questions. Those are valid questions, important questions, but oftentimes, yeah, you're right. It's not the tool at all. It's like, doesn't matter like really like what you created it in. It's just kind of like the thinking behind it. And yeah.
For sure.
Anyways, I could go on for a long time about this stuff, but very interesting. Okay, I'll do this. Thank you so much for comments, everybody. Thanks, Ellie and Dustin, for chiming in and sharing about that stuff. Feel free to constantly do that, by the way. So one of the first things I did when I created, I wanted to create those big swirls initially. I wanted to see if I could pull those off, because I thought that if I could pull those off, those would be the hardest parts, and they're kind of like the main piece of Starry Night, you know, like they're like the main expressive things, the centerpieces, if you will, of the painting. So I thought, you know, it's really important that I get those right. So I thought, you know, I would just create a mask, simple enough, and then use a mask emitter. But I quickly ran into some challenges, and I think that that's why I'm really excited about sharing this stuff today, because, you know, I've been using Particular for like a long time, been teaching Particular for a really long time. But sometimes when you actually use it practically, there are so many little tiny baby challenges that you run into. And I ran into millions of those on this project. And I had to like really think creatively and use techniques that I had never used before. So my mask thing created beautiful animation. I mean, I think this is really gorgeous. I'm gonna turn off the music because you can't hear it anyways. But if anybody wants the exercise files of this, I can post them. And the piano playing, I recorded it myself so that I could distribute that with the exercise files too. So like all this stuff is like exercise file distribution friendly. But anyways, you know, I got these masks and I used those as emitters, and I really love. There's a beautiful look, but you know, as these particles are emanating here, they're coming directly like out from the mask, and I don't know. That's not really what I wanted. And so I tried fiddling with orientation and everything, but I couldn't get the particles to orient along the path itself. And there isn't really, there's like a path start and end options, which are great. So I can have these like grow on, which is amazing, but nothing that I could find that recognized the shape of the mask and would follow that. So then I was like, I need to use a light emitter, which is actually pretty cool, because what I could do, I'm just gonna, I'll delete this. I'll delete both of these. What I can do is I'll create a new light, and by default, Particular looks for lights with the name emitter at the beginning. You can change that if you want to, but then what I could do is I went into my masks. I could select the mask with my main swirl here. I'm going to Control or Command C to copy that. Then I could go into the emitter, press P for position, and with position selected, I can press Command or Control V, and that pastes the mask into the position keyframes, and the points of the mask become the keyframes of the shape. And also it does something really interesting, which is create something called roving keyframes, if you're not familiar with that, where there are these like keyframes inside, so that the inside points keep their relative space. So then I could just take this last keyframe and stretch this out, and everything proportionally scales, which is pretty cool. So then I could go in, and actually, you know, I'll do is I'll just back this up, stretch this out, so that we can not wait so long. And then I can change the emitter type to light. And then as this grows, oh wait, what am I missing? What am I missing? I always miss something. Okay, I got my light emitter, and okay, well, that doesn't seem to be working. Let me back up to what I had before with my other layers and see if that's working. This is the type of thing that like I'll punch myself later and be like, why didn't I do this thing? So here, this is working. I mean, this is colossal. The emitter size is like ridiculous. So I'll take this down to like 10. But what's really cool with this is that I now have the ability to control so much of my particles because I'm using a light. And one of the things I really love that you can't do with Mask and After Effects is I can go in per point and adjust the 3D space of each point. So when it's a mask, you don't have that ability. Like if I open up my masks, like you don't have the ability to go into each point and put it in a different spot. I mean, theoretically, I guess I could go into 4 views and fiddle with it that way, but I don't have control over exactly where I want that to be in terms of a pixel space. But when they are a part of an emitter, a light, like that's one of the great benefits of using a light, is that I can adjust each of the points each of these keyframes in 3D space. So I cannot have only have the swirl moving, the light moving on this like 2D swirl, but I could actually have it coming forward and back with the line as well, which is really powerful. So that is how I created the swirl here. Now, as I make this a little bit bigger, let's say 100. So I'm making the emitter bigger. What's happening is, and I've already done this, it's kind of cheating a little bit, but by using this, I can go into the particle area, go into rotation, and I could adjust the rotate Z. So I couldn't get it to follow the path of the light either, but when I have the rotate Z option on the mask, like it's coming from the point of the mask. So it's kind of like bristles on a toothbrush, and you're like rotating it, but it's stuck that way. But with the light, they're kind of like this way. So then what I did is I animated the particle rotation over time, and it created these like beautiful, like this is like, you know, one of my favorite parts of the piece is that, so like the particles, they change in rotation so that it appears that they follow the curve. And I find that to be really gorgeous. Ooh, another thing that I did, which is really lovely, that really changed things, because the particles grew on in the swirl, and that's fine, but really it's the fluid motion that brings this to life, because as I added fluid motion to this, so in the physics simulations, there's fluid, I enabled fluid, leave this set to default buoyancy and swirl only, and I brought down the buoyancy very, very small, because I didn't want the particles to really like elevate like Alka-Seltzer bubbles or something like that. You know, I just wanted just a little bit of lift. And then I had a really big swirl scale, so I don't want a bunch of like little small details. I kind of want to just kind of like morph over time, which is really hard because, you know, when you're a painter, you know, like you can spend a lot of time making like the perfectly balanced composition. And this is like a flawless quintessential piece of art because it is so in balance. But I took some artistic liberties, because if this was in motion and these things were fluid, like this moment would just be a moment. This would just be like a snapshot in time. These particles would have to, these trails would have to come from somewhere and go somewhere. So I had them kind of swirling on and then kind of blossoming. And so the fluid motion kind of over time kind of starts to kind of warp this a little bit and has these particles kind of like slowly drifting up, which adds so much to the kind of the life of them. So they're kind of just like all like lifting up a little bit. And these particles over here don't. So then like these just kind of like rise over time. You can see towards the end of the composition there, these particles will just kind of like dissipate and spread. And then these here are kind of where they are. And I went with a little bit more gentle settings than that for the final, but that's how I made those. Now, moving on, I'm going to show you the different pieces, because honestly, the actual project ballooned up so big, and it took so long to render. Just the background, let's see here. Yeah, just the background alone, just these particles in the background, it took, I don't know, 16 hours, I think, to render. It was colossal. So it was a huge undertaking. And then all of these, like what I've noticed with Particular, maybe it's just me, my system, I don't know. But the more systems I have, the more it starts to kind of like bog Particular down. And there's so much going on here that oftentimes stuff that I would have done on one instance in particular with a bunch of systems, the systems started becoming so robust, each one, that I had to separate them into multiple layers. Sometimes that was for more control, but other times it was just because Particular was just getting bogged down so much I couldn't work. Like the form background here, it was like 30 seconds. Anytime I made any change to any parameter, it was 30 seconds to like update the frame and see the change. I'd have to just like sit there for like half a minute and just like wait. Okay, so one of the things that, yeah.
Quick question
Please.
coming from Samuel. So on the previous project with the sort of the light swirls and the paint strokes, he was wondering, could you show what the individual particle looks like? So each individual sort of paint stroke particle, if possible.
Yes. That is a brilliant question, and I'm going to get into this a little bit. And in order to see this, I'm actually going to take down the particle. I'll just say like 100. That's actually a very, very good question. Thank you, Samuel. Bonus points to you, my friend, because initially, like when I was doing my tests, I was like, let's just see if this works. And so I went into the particle settings, and I chose a sprite, and then I clicked on choose sprite, and there is a little capsule that comes with Particular. And I'll load this bad dude up. There we go. Just a little capsule. This comes with Particular as part of the Sprite library. And I chose this because I knew that eventually, if I was going to pull this off, I would want a paint stroke. Like I'd want like some kind of like actually a series of paint strokes, like a paintbrush strokes, in order to be my sprites. And I didn't know how I would pull that off, and so I'm going to talk about where that came from. But as a working thing, I use these capsules because this is kind of like a ballpark thing. You know, like if I just use like a sphere, I could get some cool motion. But part of what I needed to know is, can I make these particles flow, and can I influence the direction of them, because I knew I was going to eventually use the paint strokes. So the capsules gave me a sense of how the particles are flowing and the movement there, and that was really essential. And then capsules, as we'll see in just a moment, capsules ended up playing a huge role in the particles. So that's all it is, just the sprite, the particles, just to get started. But then well, there's a saga with what I actually ended up using in the end. I'll get to that in a moment. So thank you, bonus points. Now, I wanted to create the moon here. And I thought at first that I would just kind of like make a mask of this. But then I thought, well, I wonder if I could just make this out of particles. And my initial plan, actually, if I had more time, I would have made everything out of particles. I think that would have been like way cooler, but I just ran out of time. So I'm going to go to the like layer map moon. And basically, this is just, again, the capsules. And this is just tons of capsules. And they're not really doing anything. I guess there's a little bit of movement on them. Actually, let me take off the movement. It'll render faster if I just take this off. Boom. There we go. Okay. So we just have capsules, and they're just like plain white, boring capsules. So how could I make this look like the moon? So what I did was, and this is something that I use constantly throughout, a technique that I use constantly throughout that was very helpful. I actually went in and I made, oh, I can't see it because, you know, raise that up. So I went into Starry Night, the painting, and I just made a mask around the moon. So this layer exists with an alpha channel because of the mask. So then what I can do is use layer maps, which are now in Particular, thankfully, which is pretty cool. So I changed the emitter to box, so I could use the emitter behavior classic form. So essentially using Trapcode form here in Particular. But I also learned too, which is pretty cool, there's some interesting things that are available to you in layer maps in Particular when you're using form particles that are not available in actual Trapcode form, which is quite interesting to me. So what I did was close this up and go into layer maps, which allows you to use another layer to map attributes to your particles. So I can choose my moon map layer, and I don't want to just use the source. I want to use masks. And I don't know if I used color or anything. I'm just going to say effects and masks. I usually just say effects and masks to be safe. And then it's going to, over time, use the stuff on that layer, which is cool, but it's not using the alpha channel because it's by default mapped to RGB to RGB, but I actually want to map the RGB and alpha over to this as well. Now I could just say A to A, so I'm just using the alpha channel, so you could do that if you want to. So if you want your particles only to show up in a certain shape, like a logo shape, then you could map the alpha of the logo to the alpha of your particles, and that's the only thing that carries over. But I actually want the color and the alpha. So now I have particles in the shape of a moon, and it's dynamic because I'm using the masks. So what I did was Actually, I'll just type MM to reveal the properties. And I'll set a keyframe for mask expansion. Let's say I want it to be there at that frame. Back up, and then I can reduce the mask expansion. So this kind of like shrinks and eats away on itself. So we're kind of like shrinking what the mask can do. And then what that does is, because I animate that, it allows the moon to kind of like grow on in like a pretty way. And the final, it's like very subtle. It just happens over like a couple frames, but you can kind of see eventually, wait for it. There we go. So the moon kind of just like animates on like that, kind of like it goes from nothing and just kind of blossoms on in a way that I liked. Okay. One more thing, and then we're going to get to custom particles here. One of the challenges I had was creating the stars. And let's see here. What do we have? Let's solo the moon star. One of the challenges I had was trying to get the stars. Sorry, the music is playing my head, or not my head. It's actually in real life.
What does that music sound like, Chad?
It sounds like boom, 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 boom. No, interesting enough, the side note about the music is that like I picked a piece that was written about the same time and about in the same place as Starry Night. So, you know, a little bit of fun history there. It's Germanopédie #1 for those of you who are curious. Also, my apologies to Lionel because I just butchered a French word, which is probably very revolting.
De Eric Satie.
Yes. Eric Satie, like you said. I should have just like paused and had you come on and say that. Okay, let me accelerate the rate at which I'm explaining things because this is like I got a lot more to cover. A few things I really want to get to, but creating this shape proved to be very challenging for me, which was kind of it hurt my particular trainer self-esteem because, you know, this shouldn't be that difficult, I was telling myself. But to create concentric circles of particles that emanate out and have the orientation, maintaining that relationship to the center was actually really, really tough. And also, I needed them to kind of like emanate out to a certain range and just kind of like stop-ish in a certain range. And that was very, very difficult. So the way I was able to do that was just with the default point emitter and with the direction being uniform, because that's the only way that I could have the particles. Like if I make a default, which I've already done for you here, like a default setting of particular here. Okay, my After Effects is already slowing down. I can't move the screen. There we go. Okay, there we go. So we have the default setting of particular here. If we choose the direction of uniform, and only, this is the only way, I mean, the only way that I could find to do this, I had to have the emitter type be point and the direction be uniform. And it's the only way I was able to figure out how to do this. But then you could kind of get that like sparks look where like the particles are oriented to the center, which is really interesting because everything else, you know, if you orient to a certain direction, they're all kind of pointing the same direction, the same angle. But when it's uniform, they can point towards the center. And if the emitter type is point, because when it was sphere, that just kind of all went out the window. The uniform direction was just kind of like all over the place based on where the particle grew from. So it had to be from a point and it had to be uniform. That's the only way I could get the orientation right. And then I could go into particle rotation and rotate them. So instead of kind of like coming from the center, they could point this way towards the center and emanate that way. So at that point, it's a matter of playing with the velocity. And the way I was able to do this is to have a lot of velocity, and then I fiddled with the life so that they died out at a certain point. And then also I went into the physics of the thing here, or the environment, I guess. I went into environment and increased air density. So that way I was able to get a dense amount of particles in a small space and not have them kind of like wandering out. And then the life made it so that they didn't like kind of keep growing. So by fiddling with the velocity, the life, and the air density, I was able to kind of shoot them out, but then also kind of get the shape that I wanted with those stars. Another important part of this is that I went into the color settings and went to random from gradient, and then I sampled colors from the actual stars themselves here. And what's really interesting is that, like, I mean, these look really vibrant when they're particles, but in the gradient ramp, it looks really muddy and gross. We just have to trust it. Like, I'm not looking at the ramp, I'm just trusting that it's fine, it's working, and then it ended up being really pretty. Okay, couple quick things to get to. The custom particle thing took me a ridiculous amount of time, and I was embarrassed by how long this took me, because I wanted to use actual paint strokes. Also, are there any questions? Will I take a dramatic pause to drink this?
Well,
That
there is
was actually one. Oh, you go,
Yeah.
Lionel, you go.
Yeah, there is a question about the paint stroke actually. So you're just there. It's perfect.
Okay.
Read their minds.
Cool. Okay, so I looked everywhere for a paint stroke. I even like went to ZBrush because I thought maybe there's like an alpha that's kind of like a brush. But the thing is, I needed to not just have a paint stroke. I needed multiple paint strokes. So if everything is just one paint stroke, then, you know, it'll be really obvious, like spread over all these different things. So I needed a lot of paint strokes. Another thing is that, you know, I thought about going into Photoshop and actually sampling, you know, like, because I have a really big high-res version of Starry Night, and I wanted to sample the actual like paint brushes, but that would take forever. So nothing was coming together. So I thought what I would do is I'd actually use the capsule itself, especially because it's like the right size and it's like optimized for particular sprites, and it's already kind of like being used. So what I did is I actually took the actual sprite and I pre-composed it. So I said move all attributes, and then pre-comp paint particle. Let's say that. That didn't do what I wanted it to do. I said, okay, that's fine. And then I changed this to be like 10 frames long, and I made like, I wanted to make 10 copies. And actually, you know what I could do? I'm just gonna do that. This is like one of the coolest parts of the thing, I thought. This was like one of the more fun and interesting things that I did. So, and I'll go ahead and I'm just gonna change this to be 10 frames. So in the duration, I'm gonna say there's a 10 frame long composition. So then I started kind of fiddling with this, and I tried a bunch of different techniques and things like that. Like one of the things I did was Turbulent Displace. Oops, that's the wrong thing to search. There we go. Turbulent Displace. So then I can, you know, play with this and get these kind of like different settings. Another thing I did was I added Roughen Edges, and actually I put this before Turbulent Displace so that Turbulent Displace would displace the edges, increase the border a bunch, and play with like, I don't know, the scale or whatever I wanted to do. Now the challenge is like, well, how do I do this for, you know, every paint stroke? Oh, another thing that I did too, I'll just, for sake of time, I'll just kind of cut the story short a little bit. So I did this and it was like pretty cool, but it still didn't have any texture. And so I was like, oh, what do I have to do for texture? Because like, I don't want the sprite to be like a really heavy thing. So what I did is I just pulled a Van Gogh himself. You know, when you look at this stuff, you know, when I got up close and I looked at this, there are so many things that are unexpected. Like there's so many colors, like there's a bunch of mint green over here, and there's a bunch of like black in some of these stars. But Van Gogh had this way, and the Impressionist movement in general, like they could hint something to the eye without just like laying it on really thick. There'd just be like random little like shots of like red in here and colors that you might not think would fit, but just a hint of them, and then your brain kind of fills in the rest. So taking a page out of that book, I thought, well, I could just hint at a paint stroke. So I can add like fractal noise and go in and make this non-uniform scale and you know, scale this up a lot and then increase the contrast. And if I put this before the turbulent displace, then it can start to look like a paint stroke. So maybe take down or up the brightness. So as you can see, I'm fiddling with that, and from far away, if you squint your eyes, you know, it starts to look like a paint stroke. So then my challenge was, well, how do I quickly replicate this so that I have a bunch of different paint strokes? And one of the ways is with the index expression. You guys ever use the index expression? It's like I never hear people talking about the index expression. It doesn't get very much love, but I think it's great. And for those of you that are might be intimidated by expressions, like, oh, great, we got to learn an expression. The index expression is actually the easiest expression that exists. It is the easiest expression that you could possibly create, and it's pretty weird and crazy and unique what it does. So I like to apply this to the random seed. So I'm going to alt-click the random seed stopwatch of the turbulent displace, and I'm going to type the word index, and that's it. That's it. That's why it's the easiest expression. There's no like frequency or time or anything like that. There's nothing else you have to worry about. It is just index. That's all it is. And what the index value does, or index expression, is that it uses the number of the layer. So this is layer 1. And so if I type EE to reveal my expressions, you can see that we have a random seed of 1. Now I got to go in and, like, you know, change some of these settings because this is kind of ridiculous. But anyways, there we go. So now what happens when I duplicate this, layer 2 has a random seed value of 2. Duplicate it again, random seed value has a value of 3. So just by duplicating this, I now have 10 different random paint strokes. And I could select all of these and right click, go to keyframe assistant, sequence the layers, and then click OK. And they're automatically staggered. And I have these different paint strokes. So then I can go into my stars, which were just capsules here. And I can go into my particle settings and have it use this where's my, did I not set that up? Okay, I'll just say use the one that I already created. And then I just want to change the time sampling from random still frame. So it's just gonna pull a random, it's gonna look at the composition, it's gonna see it's a composition, and every time it generates a particle, it's just gonna take a random frame from that composition and then use it as a still frame. And so then we have these kind of like custom particles here. So we have what looks like from far away to be paint strokes with like depth, but realistically this is just, you know, a little bit of a bendy fractal noise, a little bit of twist. Another thing I found out that helped is that there's an aspect ratio value, which I've never really used before, I don't think. But there's an aspect ratio to the particles themselves, and by default it's set to 1. But I found that the particles work a little bit too rotund by default. They were like just like too thick and blotchy. And rather than going back through and changing these, because I kind of wanted this to change per thing. I wanted the moon to use a different thickness of particles and the swirls to use different thickness of particles. I just changed this with the aspect ratio. So I could take this to 0.7, and then it kind of like makes them like a little bit more slender, like they're scaled non-uniformly along that axis, made them thin, which is exactly what I was looking for. So that's how I did that. Okay, we're quickly running out of time. Let me just show you very briefly a couple things. So the way I made the particles for the background is that I had these particles, same thing like the capsules, and then I used the layer map deal, and I created this color map in Photoshop. let's see if I can get this to show up. There we go. I went into Photoshop and I just used the clone stamp, and I was very, very rough about it, but I just took details from around these different areas and I just kind of like painted them in. So I had just roughly the same type of variation of color that that Van Gogh used in the Starry Night for these different areas. Then I can go into this background here and say, use the color map for the colors of these capsules. And then we get that color. I made them a lot more dense, but I'm not going to do that here for the sake of time. And then I could displace them. So I go in the turbulence field and adjust the displacement of these particles. Maybe we need a little bit more than that. There we go. So you can start to see them displacing, but it's like too fine-tuned. So I went into the turbulence field controls. Kind of hard to see, but it's in the turbulence field controls. And then I took down TF scale to something very small. So like 1.6, I believe, is the value that I used. So instead of being like a bunch of like really busy noise elements, we now have like big, flowing, smooth. I'll crank up the display so you can see that a little bit better. There we go. So now we have like a big, flowing, like smooth background. And then to really sell this, what I did was I went into the particle settings and rotation and increased orient to motion to a really high value. So if you say 0, then the particles remain at their orientation, which is just kind of like, just straight on, and it just felt weird. So by cranking up orient to motion, then as these particles are displaced in this kind of like undulating fractal pattern, they point towards the direction that they're going in a subtle way, but in also a way that's like really gorgeous. So I have the original colors from the background of Starry Night, and I have this kind of like nice flowing thing. And you can see that in here. If we look at the final deal, you can see they just kind of like orient, and they kind of like move in that direction. Kind of a nice like subtle movement, especially because I knew I wanted to start this with like a naked sky. I wanted that to be a little bit sexier than just kind of like something plain, Finally, the last thing I wanted to cover like really quickly, we did, I wanted to stylize this and make it kind of feel more romantic. So I rendered it out like full speed. And so everything was like really smooth and flowing. And I like that, I like how these particles look, but I don't know, it just felt kind of digital. So what I did was I created an adjustment layer. And on that adjustment layer, I used Posterize Time. And you can take Posterize Time, which basically changes the frame rate, allows you to change the frame rate. So I brought it down to like a very low value, maybe 7 frames per second. And there's just something very organic about that by taking the frame rate down. Of course, if you're watching this over GoToWebinar, so you might be like, it's basically Posterize Time the whole time anyways. But if you play on your own, you'll see that like, instead of being just like the smooth flowing thing, it's like kind of like stop motioning. And then to add to that, I actually added, oops, that's not what I wanted to do, brightness and contrast, and then just brought the values to like 1 or 2 or something like that, and then used a wiggle expression so that it just kind of like randomly was like bright. And then I also used a little bit of Misfire from Red Giant Universe to create some like extra kind of like vignetting and splotches and other things to kind of create the final look. So it was a little bit kind of like worn and again, not too digital. I also used a little bit of Turbulent Displace. I cut up each of these layers in Photoshop. You can't tell, but I went into Photoshop and I cut up each of the layers, the cypress tree and all these different pieces. And then I used a little bit of Turbulent Displace, like on the cypress tree, it's just kind of like warbling up, waving a little bit. And then each layer of the background is also kind of like warbling with Turbulent Displace. I was going to show that, but it's not like, mission critical or that essential really. But you can see that well, I'll just play this much of it since that's what's loaded in there. You can see that there is this kind of like, you know, stop motion feel, and the stop motion feel is added by the randomness of the light, as if somebody went in and just kind of like painted every frame, like that movie Loving Vincent, or something like that. There's just like a little bit of like randomization to make it feel less digital and more kind of more organic. But anyways, that's what I wanted to cover. That's the gist of the business. A couple things we didn't get to, but you know, we covered all the main thingies. So
that was so amazing. There's some really lovely comments coming in saying it's a masterpiece, so much fun. What would Van Gogh think? Fantastic and awesome.
Thank you.
I agree. It's such an amazing piece, and the way you've recreated it with these really clever sort of techniques. And I love like how you deliberately do techniques to make it seem less digital is what I think is great.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like that's a really interesting thing. When we first started out doing, you know, a lot of these kind of like graphics, like, you know, like the Matrix and like the titles we created like 20 years ago, we really leaned into, we could do digital graphics. We want them to look digital, but now we have so much power, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like beautiful to step away from that and try to recreate the organic feel of natural things, where it fits and where it makes sense. So yeah. Thanks for your comments. It was really fun talking about like art stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Are you happy to share the project file and also a final export available to view? Cameron was wondering, like the final version of this, if you've got that anywhere.
Yes. So I think it'll take a while to like load into. Oh, you know what I could do? I could wonder if I could just grab this. Yeah. And I could probably include this with the exercise files as well. So here's like the final. I'll turn off the audio since you can't hear it anyways. Yeah, never mind.
Wow.
Pretty nice.
Nobody else?
I reload the swirl at the end.
Yeah.
That's the trick.
Thank you. I was kind of struggling with what to like show for this session because there were so many little challenges and obstacles, you know, creating like the two different swirls. And then I had to also composite it together because it was so beefy that I had to render each element out separately and then bring it into After Effects to composite the composite. It's kind of an interesting, there's also a camera push in. I separate everything out in the 3D space and you can't really, you know, tell the camera push in, but you know, there's just some interesting challenges here and there. And I wasn't really sure like, you know, what to cover in this, but yeah, so there's like a little MP4 that I just showed, and I could include that with the project files as well. So yeah, thanks for asking. That's cool.
Subtle details. You know that the camera Z, I'm sure we can't really see it, but we can feel it. It adds to the end. I'm surprised you did I was sure you the pen stroke came from Photoshop, and actually the capsule thing, it works really well.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I was really surprised by how that came across. Like it was the Van Gogh thing of just hinting at it. So just having the hint of fractal noise with the turbulent displace, like it felt like a 3D paint stroke. When you look at it up close, it's like, this is garbage. This is.
How many layers did you use in the final?
Oh, let's see.
So like, you know, you were layering up those individual paint strokes and getting the different random seed. Because they all look completely different. There's like, to me, there's no repetition in those paint strokes, like at all.
Yes. Let's see. The final paint thing that I used. Yeah, I think I just used 10 different layers, 9 different layers actually. Yeah. So this is the final, my paint stroke. So yeah. So those are the actual paint strokes that I used.
It's
this
crazy
one even goes
how
off the
only
edge.
those 10 like are represented across that whole thing, and it looks to me like they're not like repeating sprites, but I mean they are.
Thank you. Yeah, I think little bit of random size, you know. Yeah, a little bit of random size, you know, makes a big difference. So yeah, thanks so much for the engagement, everybody. I was so worried about this like session being like super crappy, so just like me blabbing the whole time, and like your comments and everything like that was like really helpful, and thank you so much.
No, you should read the last kind of like 20 comments are just a bunch of thank yous. Jim's mind just exploded. James is saying it's insane. Moments in a art history of Chad should be a regular thing.
I like this one.
Maybe that'll be a new series.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it's a little bit of a diversion to talk about like art stuff, but thanks for bearing with me. That was really fun.
No, everyone loved it, and they were saying how it's really nice to hear like the artistic process as much as just sort of like the technical buttons do this and this is the technique. It's like in the day, as a lot of people were saying, and as we're all artists like at our core, as much as we do live training and we want to teach as much as we can, the reason we do these things is because we are artists, and it's a creative process as much as it's a technical one.
Yeah, I totally agree. But then we have next week.
Yes, go on. On next week's episode of Demystifying with
Next
Chad.
week is going to be like doing away with all creative things, and we're just going to get into technical stuff. But we're going to go into Houdini next week, and a smidge of Unreal, but mostly we're going to spend our time in Houdini. And if you've never used Houdini, it's like overwhelmingly complicated and challenging. So probably half of our time we're just going to be like, this is what a basic thing is in Houdini. Like, we're not going to make anything like unbelievable, but hopefully after next week, like, you have a really solid foundation for exploring more, because Houdini is, you know, what most people think of as like the ultimate and most powerful particle system out there in the world. So so we'll get into that. We'll go into a little bit of Houdini particles, and you'll see why we don't get it too much into Houdini particles. And also some rendering with Redshift in Houdini, because there's Redshift in Houdini. So take that knowledge with us, which is pretty fun. And like I said, a little splash of Unreal. So we'll keep the party going, and that should be pretty fun.
That's awesome. So yeah, just as a quick recap, everyone, this will be on the Maxon Training Team YouTube either later tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on your time zone. And yeah, Chad, it would be really cool, you know, to upload that onto the Dropbox link and the MP4 as well for everyone to see. There isn't GoToWebinar's excellent frame rate. I loved your burn earlier. It was
great. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, once again, thank you everyone for being here live. Thanks to everyone who watched this on YouTube and for all your amazing questions. And thanks to Lionel and Dustin and to Chad for, you know, being here and answering questions in the background and, you know, keeping the engagement going. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. Great to be here as always.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, final week next week. I won't be here next week, but I will leave you in everyone's capable hands right here. And I hope you'll have a lovely rest of your Monday. If you're enjoying the hot weather, like me, I'm going to go outside and enjoy it now. But yeah, have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.